Are you a skeptic or a believer? For Prophecies of the Millennium.
There would be wars and rumors of wars. There would be a great increase in earthquakes, plagues, famines, floods.
They felt that they were God's chosen people, that Armageddon would be a confrontation between the forces of the satanic world.
You're going to go through the fire.
Home is like taking Charles Manson and putting him on the bridge of the Starship Enterprise.
I look around and I see signs, unlike signs that have ever been in the past. Yitzhak Rabin will be killed. Arafat, a strange peace.
World War III is to come.
We're suddenly realizing there's some kind of a code here that we are ready to crack.
Mabus, M-A-B-U-S. If you reverse a word, which is a common practice in Nostradamus, Mabus looks like Saddam backwards.
Some criminal faction within the former Soviet republics could find themselves in a situation where they had their hands on a nuclear weapon, and that in turn found its way into the hands of Saddam Hussein.
We're going to see a rogue group use a chemical, biological, or nuclear weapon someplace, somewhere. It's only a question of when it will happen.
Many of history's greatest prophecies have predicted an eventual end to the world. While most of us toss those predictions aside as superstition, the experts who study such legendary prophets as Nostradamus say the apocalypse is coming, and it's only a few years away. Since the dawn of time, prophets have warned that the end is coming. Eventually, a great catastrophe will occur and mankind will cease to exist. The only question is how and when. From the great prophets of the Bible and the writings of Nostradamus in the 16th century, to the words of visionaries today, an increasing number of experts are now predicting a date, the year 2000, the Millennium.
There's no question about the fact that unusual, inexplicable, and if you like, miraculous, in the sense of not understood by science, phenomena are taking place at the end of the 20th century.
According to a chillingly diverse group of prophecy interpreters, we have roughly 1,000 days until oblivion.
I see it descending from the skies in the form of some alien form, some alien life, perhaps even a colliding comet or asteroid.
These warnings are not ravings from madmen shouting the end of the world is at hand, but carefully considered reports from prophecy scholars representing all walks of life.
There are 3 wars of Armageddon prophesied. Our sages have taught 2 of them have already transpired, World War I and World War II. Yes, a World War III is to come.
The most terrifying apocalyptic visions come directly from the Bible and other religious texts. Rabbis, fundamentalist Christians, and even Native American soothsayers are all reaching the same conclusions.
I think we are bent on destruction. I think that we are leaving the old path. If there is an end to anything on this planet in the next few years, it's going to be the end of mankind.
Apocalyptic fears like these, as the millennium ends, are not new. Many people were also convinced in the year 999 that the world was going to end. Millennium thinking seems deeply rooted in our collective consciousness.
The millennium myth is the most powerful myth in the history of the Western world. And what it comes down to is the hope or the vision that history is going to come to an end. The classic text that expounds this vision is, of course, the book of Revelation.
Revelation is part of the New Testament that predicts a time in the near future where nations will fight an almost unimaginable war, killing 1/3 of mankind. According to author Michael Grosso, the simple term millennium has historically been associated with the notion of the biblical end times.
Millennium and apocalypse. The great prophecy is that there will be a new heaven and a new earth. But before that comes about, there will be a final conflict between the forces of good and evil.
Like Grosso, biblical scholar Hal Lindsey and writer Moira Timms believe dire prophecies from Revelation are now preoccupying people in record numbers, and for good reason.
The prophet who wrote the book of Revelation says, I looked, I saw, and I heard. A first-century man was propelled up to the end of the 20th century, and he actually saw a war of technical marvels. An intercontinental ballistic missile warhead re-entering the Earth's atmosphere. Poison water, radioactivity, every city on Earth virtually destroyed.
1945 appeared to be a time when all the prophecies were saying something would happen to inaugurate a prophecy cycle. And the ending of all of this either means some kind of global cataclysm, or it'll be a completely new phase of human evolution.
It's not only the book of Revelation that predicts the devastating end of civilization as we know it, but Hopi Indian prophecy also warns us about the imminent peril caused by our disregard for our home planet.
The Hopi have always been painfully aware of the degradation of the Earth's fundamental processes through ignorance and misuse of the land. The Hopi see all of this in sum total as killing the Great Mother. They feel they've been unable to uphold their trust. And so this is another major way that the Great Purification is being hastened.
If Revelation and Hopi prophecies are true, then what is most alarming is how accessible the trigger to Armageddon has become, due to the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction.
We have to look at somebody like Saddam Hussein, who does not think beyond a certain level and thinks very tactically. Not a dumb man, very, very evil individual in my view. Could he unleash a terrible result that could kill thousands? Certainly he could.
Other Millennium prophecies imply that humankind will not go out with a bang, but with a whimper.
Many prophecies address the fact of extinctions and new species appearing, viruses, new diseases, old diseases reflaring.
The hantavirus, Ebola, HIV, AIDS, all of these diseases are part and parcel of Hopi prophecy, which says that there will be bad winds.
Even the weather itself is signaling that our days may be numbered, which follows the alarm sounded by the 20th century American clairvoyant Edgar Cayce.
The Edgar Cayce readings talk about these times as we approach the millennium as times of accelerated geological change in the Earth, including the possibility of pole shifts. These times would be times of crisis related to the environment, to political structures, technological change, struggles between the haves and the have-nots.
Some young fellows drove in a car, hoping to get some guns, and said they got some bullets.
We've seen floods all over the world of record proportion. We've seen hurricanes of devastating power.
Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, many towns could suffer huge earthquakes at 8.5, maybe off the scale.
You underneath that?
The things that we're seeing now are only, if you will, hiccups. Small things compared to those things which must come.
But perhaps the most chilling vision of our future is not knowing what awaits us at the dawn of a new century, which has caused frightened individuals to take matters into their own hands.
We're seeing a proliferation of apocalyptic sects. Some of them may turn violent, and a few of them may turn extremely violent.
I'm ready to be delivered. I'm ready to go to the portals of darkness and death. Let's see if you believe the message.
Bombing of the federal building in Oklahoma City, it's happened once, but will happen again.
Fundamentalists from the Middle East, fundamentalists from our own Middle West, they're answering, if you will, to a higher authority, to the heavens. And it doesn't matter who's going to live and who's going to die.
What all this is saying is that a significant number of us may be going sooner rather than later. And the way I view it is nobody gets out of here.
The prophets who warn the world may end. Believers say just look at their track records. The accuracy of seers like Nostradamus, Edgar Cayce, biblical prophets seems uncanny, to say the least.
No one has a better record for predicting future events than Nostradamus, the 16th century French clairvoyant. For 400 years, Nostradamus has amazed the world with a string of incredibly accurate prophecies.
He predicted the moonwalk. He predicted the Challenger disaster. He predicted the assassination on Kennedy and the Gulf War.
Like the great biblical prophets, Nostradamus saw an impending Armageddon. But according to John Hoke, author of Nostradamus, The New Revelations, the legendary seer accomplished something no one else has ever done. He may have given us the actual date.
He gives astrological dates saying that it would happen during the end of a century at a certain configuration of planets at the time of a comet passing. In March of 1997, the comet Hale-Bopp is appearing. So it's possible that we begin counting with 1997 the times when these tribulations, natural disasters, will begin in earnest.
The idea that Armageddon could be upon us in just a matter of months may seem unimaginable, but the prediction cannot be ignored. Nostradamus' record for accuracy started with the vision that his own king would be killed in a jousting accident.
The day the king died, a crowd gathered in front of the offices of the Inquisition, demanding they burn Nostradamus at the stake.
Nostradamus escaped the Inquisition and went on to predict the rise of Napoleon, the first of three powerful antichrists that the prophet claimed would wreak havoc on the world.
He predicted Napoleon, World War I, World War II, dated, and Hitler named outright.
Nostradamus wrote that the second dreaded Antichrist, Hitler, would be born near the Rhine, and that the captain of Greater Germany would come to deliver false hope. His war will cause a great shedding of blood, and nearly 400 years before the fact, Nostradamus actually described the mesmerizing speeches Hitler used to seduce the German people.
He says, from the deepest part of Western Europe, a young child will be born to poor people, who by his speech will seduce a great multitude.
In stolzer Ergebenheit, diesem Deutschland sind gut.
He describes the people being thrown into the furnace, the Holocaust.
Nostradamus even foretold the invention and use of airplanes in World War II, providing a remarkable description of pilots wearing high-altitude masks.
He predicted that there would be fleets of air armies driven by half-pig men. If you visualize a pilot, you look at his oxygen mask, you might call him a half-pig man.
The French prophet also predicted the development of the atomic bomb and actually described how it would be used to destroy Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The prophecies about World War II were so intriguing that both the Germans and the Allies used them for propaganda. The Germans tried to demoralize the French by dropping leaflets citing Nostradamus' prophecy that France would be conquered.
The Germans used him outright as propaganda, and in response, Churchill hired people to use counter-propaganda to show that the Germans would lose the war.
If Nostradamus was right when he predicted Hitler's reign of terror as the second great Antichrist, was he also right when he predicted that a third evil Antichrist would appear before the year 2000?
His destiny is to create a third world war, probably through a terrorist event. He's not as big a fish as the other two, Napoleon and Hitler. He may be some small fry, some minor terrorist figure with a following of maybe 12 to 200 people.
Nostradamus has also prophesied that nuclear weapons would be used again in World War III. A war in Nostradamus, the Hopi Indians, the Bible, and others have prophesied for the near future. Given their accuracy on other prophecies, could we afford to ignore the warnings of a nuclear holocaust at the end of the millennium?
God is going to allow our own stupidity to destroy us with the hope and the prayer that as a race we will wake up after seeing the havoc and destruction we have caused.
As a practitioner of the Kabbalah, Rabbi Ariel Barzadok uses ancient Jewish methods of prophecy, not that different from the secrets of Nostradamus.
One becomes aware of a much greater reality, a greater understanding of time, of space, past, present, future, merge into one. This is the mind of the prophet, and as such, we can see things both far off and close.
Nostradamus' prophecies didn't stop with World War II. He predicted the violent deaths of the Kennedys.
The great man will be struck down in the day by a thunderbolt.
Nostradamus was not alone in looking across the centuries to foretell earth-shaking occurrences. Rabbi Bar Zadok is among a group of Israeli prophets who've taken prediction of the modern age by analyzing the Torah with high-tech computers. These visionaries believe they've uncovered a code, enabling them to unlock extraordinary revelations about present-day events, including references to the Gulf War, retired General Schwarzkopf, and Saddam Hussein.
Does Stuart get his milk? Yes.
Many contemporary seers believe such prophetic hits are telling mankind we may be entering our last days on Earth. And recently, scientists may have found support for Millennium prophecies of unprecedented seismic convulsions Nostradamus and Edgar Cayce saw tied to the apocalypse.
The average number of killer quakes in a decade before was between 2 to 4. Now we saw 89 in the decade of the 80s. We've already seen over 150 in the decade of the 90s, and we're only halfway through.
We're entering a window where seismic activity is predicted to get quite intense. Edgar Cayce and Nostradamus seem to indicate that 1998 through the year 2000, 2001 is this window.
Back in 1932, Cayce astounded the world by being the first to predict the North and South poles would actually shift out of position near the end of the millennium, causing worldwide earthquakes and huge volcanic eruptions. Although initially dismissed as the ravings of an eccentric, Cayce's prophecies have been validated by at least part of the scientific community. Richard Noon interviewed dozens of top scientists while researching the prospect of polar shifts and other massive Earth changes.
It's quite extraordinary how some of the ancient prophecy matches new discoveries in the world of science, and quite chilling as well.
These changes may reach a climax on May 5th of the year 2000, when all the planets line up with the Sun and the Earth. The magnetic pull from such an alignment could trigger a massive polar shift, causing the Earth to undergo apocalyptic changes and leading to the massive destruction of mankind and other species, just as the Bible, Nostradamus, and Edgar Cayce have forewarned.
We're talking about the ultimate disaster. During such a shift, oceans are thrown out of their basins, inundating the land, earthquakes beyond what Richter ever dreamed, volcanic activity of turbulence of the wind of unparalleled violence, such as we haven't seen since.
While most of us may not be concerned that the end is coming, there are people who truly do believe in the apocalypse. Unfortunately, many of these believers have formed groups and have armed themselves with weapons of mass destruction. They are also ready to use them in order to make Armageddon a self-fulfilling prophecy.
In 1993, Americans first learned of the Branch Davidians, a little-known apocalyptic cult whose leader and followers staged a 51-day standoff with the federal government.
For 5 years, I have suffered in the flesh. My guts have rotted out because I have walked in the light of God's word that you could not see.
4 officers of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms were killed when they attempted to enter the compound after being informed the cult was stockpiling guns. Even more frightening than the group's massive arsenal of automatic weapons and bombs were its members' willingness to die rather than surrender. Their leader, David Koresh, had convinced them that theirs was a holy war, prophesied in the book of Revelation.
In their mindset, they were the focal point of everything, and they believed that Armageddon would be a confrontation between forces of the government, which in their minds was the satanic world, and them. And in their view, once this happened, there was no turning back.
Richard Abanis specializes in cults and new religious movements. He's written a book about David Koresh and the Waco siege.
In David Koresh's mind, and in the minds of all the Davidians, they felt that they were God's chosen people.
I waited patiently on the Lord. He inclined to me when he heard my cry. He brought me up out of a horrible pit.
We accepted him as a modern-day prophet when he first started teaching, but as his work and as his teachings progressed, we saw him as more than a prophet.
Former Branch Davidian Clive Doyle says Koresh had prepared them for the end times, the last days before Armageddon.
When things happened with the ATF and the FBI, and then of course we saw that as a, you might say, a partial fulfillment of prophecy. We saw that as definitely along the lines of what we were looking forward to.
This was not the first time the devotees to a doomsday cult were willing to follow their leader blindly to destruction. In 1978, Jim Jones led over 900 fanatical members of the People's Temple religious cult in a mass suicide in their commune in Jonestown, Guyana. The world got its first close-up look at the would-be Messiah when U.S. Congressman Leo Ryan went to Jonestown to verify reports that cult members were being held in the jungle compound against their will. But Jim Jones denied the allegations and warned all the world to leave him and his followers alone.
They lie, they lie. What can I do about liars? Are you people going to leave us? I just beg you, please leave us. Bill, we will bother nobody. Anybody wants to get out of here can get out of here. We have no problem about getting out of here. They come and go all the time.
When Ryan attempted to return a few willing cult members back to America, Jones ordered armed gunmen to kill the congressman and his party. Here you see the armed guards arrive and open fire. Seconds later, the fallen cameraman captures the last moments of the carnage. Because his murderous actions had brought his cult to the point of no return, and the apocalypse he had promised was at hand, Jones ordered 900 cult members to commit suicide by consuming a cyanide-laced drink.
In Jonestown, we had again a Messiah figure who wanted what he wanted and got his followers through his charismatic ways to follow his teachings.
Biblical warnings about the rise of false prophets signaling the end days became reality at Jonestown and Waco 15 years later. Like Jones, David Koresh's almost supernatural hold over his followers brought death to his flock. But Koresh told his group that dying in a blazing inferno would actually ignite the apocalypse that was foretold in the book of Revelation.
I have endured the race. I have seen the vision. I have exalted that testimony because you were in need of it.
They thought that if they were to kindle a fire in the middle of this great battle of Armageddon, they would actually be changed and transformed into flaming beings of judgment that would sweep through the armies of Babylon and destroy their enemies. And this is why I believe they started the fire to begin with.
More than 80 Branch Davidians and their messianic leader died in the flames. While the loss of life inspired by both David Koresh and Jim Jones was tragic, millions of other innocent people could become victims of an even more dangerous false prophet as the millennium approaches. Followers of Shoko Asahara in Japan are armed with some of the world's most dangerous weapons, and his Om sect has every intention of triggering Armageddon in the next few years.
I think if you want to see how far a group can get, how extreme a group can get, there's no better example than Om Shinrikyo.
41-year-old Asahara is half blind, but his followers believe he has prophetic vision. They go to great lengths to emulate their leader, including drinking his blood in bath water and wearing bizarre headgear that supposedly helps align their thoughts with his. And the one thought foremost in Asahara's mind is Armageddon.
They were going to destroy and recreate the world.
Investigative journalist David Kaplan says the Om cult represents a dangerous departure from millennium fanatics who believe they are living in the end times.
Om is like taking Charles Manson and putting him on the bridge of the Starship Enterprise. Absolutely frightening. Om believed that the end of the world was coming in 1996. They felt that with Armageddon around the corner, they needed weapons to fight and defend themselves. But ultimately, it became a drive to in effect, jumpstart the apocalypse.
In 1995, Om's efforts to instigate Armageddon took on apocalyptic proportions. Teams of cult members set off bags of the deadly nerve gas sarin in the Tokyo subway system during rush hour. 12 commuters were dead, 6,000 injured. Could have been much worse.
That wasn't even the real attack. The real attack was to come later.
World-renowned terrorism expert Neil Livingstone is familiar with the global dangers apocalyptic leaders and their cults can pose.
They were going to carry out an attack here, blame that on the Japanese, hope that brought the two countries to war. He believed Japan would be defeated, and then he could pick up the pieces and become the supreme leader of Japan.
And out of all this chaos, there would emerge a race of superhumans, of spiritually awakened supermen and superwomen who were the followers of Om.
Japanese officials are not treating Om Shinrikyo lightly because its members are not stereotypical lost sheep. but an elite group which includes scientists and doctors. Asahara and some of his followers are now on trial for the 1995 subway attack. The more than 40,000 Om devotees around the world remain committed to Asahara's apocalyptic vision. Visions that include using exotic viruses like Ebola to create a plague capable of wiping out mankind or bringing the world to the brink of war, just as many believe the Bible and Nostradamus have predicted as the year 2000 approaches.
You need not look at prophecies from centuries ago. All you need to do is watch the news. The signs are all around us.
Jesus said that there would be wars and rumors of wars. There would be a great increase in earthquakes. There would be a time when there would be great plagues that would sweep the earth. There would be great famines in many places on earth. There would be periods of very dry spells in formerly very agriculturally prosperous areas. There will be floods in places where there hadn't been.
These are warning signs from the Bible, said to immediately precede the apocalypse. All you have to do is read a newspaper or watch a television to know that perpetual wars, natural catastrophes, and worldwide epidemics have become front-page headlines. But these disasters are bad enough. Do they really mean the most devastating period in history is fast approaching?
I look around and I see signs, unlike signs that have ever been in the past.
The Bible warns that Armageddon will come shortly after the rebirth of Israel, which happened in 1948. And all efforts for peace in the Middle East will ultimately fail. In an eerie fulfillment of this prophecy, hopes for peace have been thwarted by assassinations. In 1981, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, the first Arab leader to recognize Israel, was killed by a hail of gunfire and grenade shrapnel while watching a military parade. In this dramatic, seldom-seen footage, Sadat's assassins jump from a truck and run toward the presidential viewing stand, while fearless cameramen record the mayhem. In the bloody aftermath, the world saw firsthand how difficult it is to obtain peace in the Middle East, just as the Bible prophets predicted. More recently, the killing of Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in November of 1995 continued to fulfill biblical prophecy about failed peace for Israel. Startling home video shows the assassin who hoped to derail Rabin's peace initiatives, firing point blank into Rabin's back. Incredibly decoded messages from the Torah apparently warned the Israelis in advance that Rabin would soon die, but the prophecies went unheeded.
There is a reference in the codes, Yitzhak Rabin will be killed, Arafat, a strange peace. I remember when these things were first being revealed in Israel, and all of a sudden, there was a tight clamp put on them. I spoke to my rabbis in Jerusalem, and I said, what happened to this information? And I was told that, shall we say, certain intelligence circles put the clamp on him.
With Israeli security officials apparently failing to act, Rabin's life came to an end. The biblical prophets said the generation that witnesses Israel's rebirth will also see certain signposts to the apocalypse, including the start of world government. The revolution in technology. And many prophecy experts say the growl of the Russian bear. According to retired Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, Russia's threat is not in its strength, but in its instability.
One of the things that I think we've really got to be concerned about is the very strong likelihood that given the state of affairs in what used to be called the Soviet Union, that some errant criminal faction within the former Soviet republics or Russia itself could find themselves in a situation where they had their hands on a nuclear weapon, perhaps one that was due to be destroyed. And that in turn found its way into the hands of the mullahs that rule in Iran, Saddam Hussein, or Muammar Gaddafi, any or all of whom would like to visit upon America the kind of terrible devastation that a nuclear weapon would bring.
Well, there are Soviet nuclear scientists today earning $20 a month. They're easy prey for governments who can come and offer them an enormous amount of money. We know that some of those scientists have already gone to Iran. Some have already gone to Libya.
And as the millennium ends, it's not just Russia's nuclear scientists who are for sale. Russia's plutonium, the radioactive ingredient essential for making nuclear weapons, is also widely available.
They don't even know how much enriched uranium and plutonium that they have, much less how to guard it. Because here we have soldiers that have not been paid in 3 to 6 months, and they have very poor pay to begin with, and they are guarding material that's worth billions of dollars on the black market.
It is horrifying to consider that as the possible apocalyptic date predicted by the Bible and Nostradamus approaches, any of a number of terrorist groups could build a nuclear bomb with plutonium leaked from Russia, which could then be hidden inside a parked car or a suitcase primed for detonation.
We have apprehended people in Europe, for example, carrying plutonium. And they've had it in checked luggage on an aircraft. Even if they're smuggling out very small amounts, it's still probably the most lethal substance to be found on Earth.
What would the World Trade Center bombing have been like if the terrorists responsible had gotten their hands on Russian plutonium, married to conventional explosives? They could have made what's called a dirty bomb and spread radioactive poison all over New York, triggering a possible nuclear confrontation.
We probably would have had to have knocked down the World Trade Center and maybe much of lower Manhattan had there been a substantial amount of radiological material combined with that bomb.
Could it be that these horrendous threats to our very existence were seen by prophets centuries ago as occurring in the coming months?
I think the World Trade Center was predicted by Nostradamus. He talks about the Garden of the World, a city that would be hit by a great fire.
In what are perhaps the most shocking millennium prophecies on record, Nostradamus predicts that an even more devastating attack will soon occur, and incredibly also gives the exact year and month it will happen. He wrote in 1999, in 7 months, the great king of terror will come from the sky. Fire approaches the great new city. Immediately, a huge scattered flame leaps up. Just imagine what it would be like if a nuclear device leveled Manhattan. Without knowing for sure who activated the weapon, our president might have no choice but to launch an all-out retaliatory strike against the most likely suspect nations. Is the ensuing nuclear nightmare that would likely follow actually the long prophesied fire and brimstone described in the book of Revelation? A final battle brought on by the destruction of New York City just before the year 2000? As to who would provoke this ultimate conflict, the French prophet who predicted that Napoleon and Hitler would be 2 of the 3 antichrists even names the third.
Mabus, M-A-B-U-S. If you reverse the word, which is a common practice in Nostradamus, Mabus looks like Saddam backwards. Saddam Hussein is a great candidate for the third Antichrist.
Saddam Hussein poses a tremendous threat to all of humanity, in my opinion.
I think Saddam Hussein is a threat as long as you have people willing to sell him weapons and technology that can allow the construction of weapons of mass destruction.
And what about the prophecies that strongly indicate an apocalypse of biblical proportions is going to consume the earth in the next 3 years?
It was long thought to be science fiction that terrorists or a rogue government would use a chemical, biological, or even nuclear weapon. But in recent years, we've come to realize it's no longer a question of if this will happen someday, but only of when.
Sealed. Must we walk like lambs to our own slaughter? Many believers feel that despite these prophecies, we are still in control of our own destiny. And there are things we can do to avert the long prophesied end of the world.
Nostradamus and other prophetic traditions don't see much
of a future beyond the year 2000 to 2012.
3, 2, 1, 0. The reality of it is mutually assured destruction, which is the policy that had governed American nuclear policy since the end of World War II, was one that we all knew would lead to that Armageddon.
Are we truly hurtling nonstop towards annihilation? Powerless to alter the Millennium prophecies that say our days are numbered? If so, perhaps it's because doomsday weapons have become available to so many, making it likely that some messianic tyrant, possibly the long-prophesied Antichrist described in Revelation and by Nostradamus, will unleash hell on earth.
Lone individuals who 25 years ago may have been armed with a gun when they go out to shoot the President of the United States or to carry out some attack against the government. Today, they could be armed with a chemical or biological weapon of mass destruction.
Prophets who glimpsed our present-day world centuries ago saw several ways humanity might perish. But perhaps the most frightening predictions could easily involve chemical and biological weapons, referred to in some circles as the poor man's atomic bomb, and they could be what ultimately wipes us out.
To destroy a square mile of human population using a chemical weapon, it would probably cost you in the thousands of dollars. To destroy a square mile using biological weapons, it might cost you $1.
Chemical weapons, historically considered too barbaric for conventional warfare by the world community, now seem fair game to potential Antichrist candidates like Saddam Hussein, who's already unleashed such weapons against Iran, the Kurds, and quite possibly against our own forces in the Persian Gulf. Over 30,000 U.S. soldiers exposed to Hussein's deadly toxins now suffer painful diseases, some of which they have passed on to their wives and children.
I think that one of the main significances of the Gulf War is it showed how one rogue nation could put a tremendous plague on the rest of the world.
Though he never used them, Hussein armed Scud missiles with warheads containing the biological agents of anthrax and botulism. Anthrax bacteria can survive almost indefinitely. Even more deadly is the Ebola virus, which kills 90% of its victims in less than a week. It's the harnessing of these diabolical instruments of destruction that are confirming the worst fears of those who believe we are living in the prophesied end times.
The release of all types of new weapons are going to drastically change the face of the earth as we know it.
What I feel is going to happen is either going to come from disease, a virus, contamination, and pollution, that kind of Armageddon.
It's possible that some lone demented individual with a master's degree in biochemistry could whip up one of these agents of mass destruction in the privacy of his garage or his kitchen and carry out a major attack on a city in the United States, or create an agent that might mutate and go wild and infect the entire world.
This is why those who think we are facing an apocalypse like the one seen by the great prophets contend we must now build up our defenses against all radical groups and potential enemy nations.
The U.S. government is doing far too little to prepare for a major catastrophe created by a chemical, biological, and nuclear weapon in this country.
We do not have the ability, because we've not deployed the science, as it were, to knock out an incoming missile from anybody, be it the Iraqis, the Libyans, the Iranians, or anybody else who might get their hands on something like that.
Whether or not our government is prepared to fend off a potential apocalypse brought about by a rogue leader or nation, some experts are convinced that as the year 2000 comes closer, high-ranking Pentagon officials are studying prophecies of the Millennium.
I think there is no question that our government places validity into the prophecies of people like Nostradamus and other prophets past.
But remember, it's not just global war that's been prophesied for an apocalyptic end of the millennium. The great seers also predicted that we will soon face natural disasters which could wipe out all of life on Earth.
There is Kabbalistic prophecy stating that there is going to be a time of 30 days of darkness that are going to cover the earth. And during this time, many people will die. And I asked my teachers, and they said, watch for something falling from the skies. Be it a meteor or a comet.
Experts warn that space-based weapons would have to be perfected if we hope to defend against a heavenly body on a predicted collision course with Earth.
I would suggest that those who think that we could survive the impact of a of a massive meteor strike or an asteroid striking this country need to think again.
A burst from whatever sort of weapon that would be able to break that comet up would only break it up into more comets.
When we consider the ominous warnings inherent in Millennium Prophecies, we must realize we may be facing something even more staggering than a natural catastrophe, an armed terrorist, a rival nation, or a thermonuclear war. What if mankind's ultimate challenge is coping with the knowledge that, like other species who have come before us, we're here for only a given period of history? And what if the prophets are right and our time is almost up?
The admonitions as I read them in the good book, both the Old and New Testament, are focused on preparing yourself for the worst that could possibly happen. And it could happen with an asteroid strike, it could happen with a nuclear bomb, it could also happen on the highway going home tonight. And that means you got to be ready personally, not just with some government program, but you as an individual out there, anywhere that's listening or watching the show.